A last question for you is, do you have any parting words of wisdom for how the review panel could mobilize this concept in their work as they assess systemic issues?
Yeah, I mean, the NHSA gives some pretty good direction, that you do need to hear the lived experience in order to understand the dignity issues, but you also need a strong normative human rights framework that has evolved to, through international experience and so on, to test what is being done against what has been learned about reasonable policies. And so you don't want to think that you're starting from a completely blank slate, right? So if it's already been determined that eviction from one's home has such severe consequences that the standard against which any decision to evict a family with children, for example, has to be assessed is a rigorous standard. And so there have been these evolving norms which are based on what's reasonable, that it has to be proportional to the objective being sought, that it has to respect the dignity issues, that it has to involve engagement with those who are affected. So there's a bit of a checklist, which I know you've kind of covered in the training materials, where it does help the review panel to kind of go through, well, did they engage with the affected communities? Have they allocated the necessary resources? Is it like coherent and non-discriminatory? Is it addressing the needs of those who are in the greatest need, at the same time as ensuring that the right to housing will be realized in this context within a reasonable period of time? So all of those kinds of standards are, they're there to be applied, not in a mechanical way, but in a way as kind of guideposts to sort of help the panel consider whether in this context the decision making has met a standard that is required. And that gives them some solid ground on which to stand when and I think they'll find the international framework very helpful. And they'll need to kind of stick with it and not be kind of convinced by a dominant legal paradigm in Canada that these kinds of decisions are best left to governments. Well, we are leaving the decisions to governments, but we're leaving the assessment of whether those decisions comply with human rights to other bodies, whether it's courts or tribunals, or in this case, the review panel. So it's a different job they have. They don't have to take over the government's job of designing housing policy, but they do have a critically important job of assessing whether particular elements of housing policy as it exists now comply with an international standard of reasonableness in light of the recognition of housing as a fundamental human right. So those two things have to be said together, right? Reasonable in the context of housing as a fundamental human right.